evening, everyone. I'm Matthew Taylor. I'm Chief Executive of the RSA. It's my great pleasure to welcome you all here for this evening's special event. Could you make sure your mobile phone is switched to silent? As well as filming the event for our online audience, we're also live streaming over the RSA website. So hello to all our online viewers. And a reminder that the hashtag is hashtag RSA Goleman. So please do get involved in the discussion on Twitter. I should thank you all for coming tonight. You all must feel rather smug that you've made it despite the terrible weather. It doesn't take much, does it, for us to feel alarmed by the weather here in the southeast. Anyway, we've all survived and we're all here together in the snug of the great room. I'm absolutely delighted to be welcoming Professor Daniel Goleman to the RSA stage this evening. As many of you will know, Daniel is the world-renowned psychologist behind the concept of emotional intelligence, one of the most powerful concepts in recent years in a number of fields, actually, particularly in education, which is an area which interests us enormously. The paradigm-shifting model, that model, emotional intelligence, which replaced the outdated IQ theory of intelligence. His book, Emotional Intelligence, stayed on the New York Times bestseller list for a year and a half, and its influence on any number of fields cannot be overestimated. He currently co-directs the Consortium for Research on Emotional Intelligence in organizations at Rutgers University, and his latest book, Focus, The Hidden Driver of Excellence, promises to be another landscape changer. I read it over the weekend, and it's actually a very interesting book to read because the first few chapters are a kind of critique of the fact that people can't focus on anything in the modern day. They keep checking their devices, and it's a very clever device, Daniel, because of course when you're reading the book, you just keep reading it because you want to prove that you're not one of those people who keeps checking their... So I was on the train and my partner said, are you okay? You haven't checked your phone for about 3/4 an hour. That's because I wanted to prove you wrong. But anyway, I can strongly recommend the book. So without further ado, please welcome Daniel Goleman.
I'm really pleased to be here. Thank you, Matthew, for that. It's a delight to be speaking at an organization which was founded in a coffee house and dedicated to changing society for the better. I hope to contribute in one small way. Let me start by telling you about a classical experiment in social psychology. It was done at a divinity school at Princeton University, and it was done with divinity students. They were told they're going to give a practice sermon, and they'd be evaluated on the sermon that they gave. Each of them was given a topic from the Bible. Half of them received as their topic the parable of the Good Samaritan, the man who stopped to help the stranger in need by the side of the road. The other half were given random Bible topics. Then, one by one, they went over to another building to give the practice sermon and be evaluated. As each of them went over to the other building, they passed a man who was bent over and moaning in pain. The question is, did they stop to help the stranger in need by the side of the road? More interesting, did it matter whether they were mulling the parable of the Good Samaritan? What do you think? Didn't make any difference. What mattered was how much time pressure they felt they were under. And that, sad to say, is rather the story of our lives, at least my life. I don't know about yours, but we have so much coming in, so much information glut these days, and pings and pop-ups on our computers and things to do, that we miss the moment more often than not. And there is a spectrum that runs from noticing the person, attuning to the person, empathizing, understanding their situation, and if they're in need or in pain, if there's something we might do to help them, having compassion for them and then acting. And if we don't notice in the first place, we won't go down that road. We don't have the opportunity. I've been a little disturbed by some data that I write about in Focus that comes out of a group at the University of California at Berkeley that's been looking at the relationship between power and attention. And basically the finding is that people of higher social status, higher power, pay less attention to people of lower power. It's quite the opposite, going up the power line, because if you have little power, if you have little that you can depend on, you actually pay much more attention to the people around you because they're resources. If you're a working mom, who's going to watch your kids till you get home from work? When they come from school, it's the neighbor that you have a good relationship with. So people of less power in society pay lots of attention to people of more power and also the people around them. They have more empathy. They have stronger connections. Wealthy people can hire someone to look after their children. So these Keltners, Dacher Keltner, the psychologist who does research, assumes that this is one of the major factors in the phenomena. The question is, what can we do to overcome this empathy gap, if you grant that there may be an empathy gap? I met a fellow from the UK when I was a graduate student. He was also a graduate student. He was from the Guinness family. He was very wealthy. And his goal, I don't know if he ever fulfilled this, was very interesting in light of this. He wanted to go back to the UK, get a job on an auto assembly line. He hoped to become elected union steward, and then to go from there to standing for Parliament on the Labour ticket. I have no idea if he did that, but what he proposed actually is the recipe, or one recipe, for overcoming this gap. When there are two groups, rich, poor, Israeli, Palestinian, Catholic, Protestant, whatever it may be, that have a divide, across that divide, if there are biases, there tends to be something called the narcissism of minor differences. This was Freud's phrase, where, for instance, I was speaking some years ago to a Turkish psychiatrist named Vamik Volkan. Vamik grew up in Cyprus, and he grew up at a time when there was animosity between the Cypriots and the Turks, and his family was Turkish. And he said, when I grew up, the Cypriots were demonized in my household. Then I got to know some, and it was nonsense. They're really no different than us. And in fact, the most powerful way to overcome divides is contact, personal contact. There's a study that was done by a psychologist at University of California at Santa Cruz now, Thomas Pettigrew. He looked at over 500 separate studies that were assessing, when you have two groups that have a divide, what is it that heals that divide? And the most powerful thing is just plain personal contact. People who have friends on the other group don't hold those prejudices, don't have those biases. The question is, at least for me, what could we do that would help children grow up without bias, without stereotype? And you can't have contact with every group, but there are programs that increase empathy in kids. And I think that this is a very positive development. In the States, it's called social emotional learning. And I made an argument for just this kind of education when I wrote Emotional Intelligence. There are now hundreds of programs in tens of thousands of schools that teach self-awareness. They teach managing your emotions effectively, and they teach empathy, and they teach cooperation, social skills. That's the emotional intelligence spectrum. But it's the empathy part of that that I think is extremely important, that children grow up understanding, when I did that, it made her feel this way. That's a basic lesson in empathy for a young child, and it gets more and more sophisticated as they grow. But what they find is that if you teach empathy to kids in this way, that schools have less bullying, kids are more tolerant, there's less bias, less stereotyping. They're better at teamwork and collaboration. When I was at the New York Times some years ago, I had an assignment to write about people who were homeless. This was in the 80s. And all of a sudden, there was a huge explosion. I don't know about London. I see lots of people sleeping on the streets here. I don't know when it began to be so commonplace, but in New York, It was the 80s. And my training was in clinical psychology before I became a journalist, and I realized as I went around with some social workers whose job was to get to know the people who lived on the street, try to get them to come to a homeless shelter, at least bring them some food. They knew every person by name who was living on the streets there. And I realized that most of them would fit into a psychiatric diagnosis. And what had happened was that the mental hospitals were closed in the state to save money, and the community programs that were supposed to have replaced them were never funded. So people who otherwise would have been in a psychiatric situation were now homeless and on the street. I don't know if that accounts for what's going on here in London. Some of it may just be unfortunate poverty. But after I did that article, I was rather sensitized, and I started noticing people that we walk by. Tonight we were walking from the hotel I was staying in down the Strand to here, and there was a guy huddled over with a blanket over him, and there are many, many of them in London. And, you know, like most of us, I just walked by, but I thought, you know, I'll stop and see what's going on. Gave him some money, and he was grateful. But it's so easy not to notice, and not to notice people in need. And it means we don't go down the compassion route. So I was on my way home from the paper. It was a Friday afternoon. It was rush hour, and I was going down in Times Square, a very busy part of New York, into the subway. And on the steps, there was a man huddled over, shirtless, not moving. And people were just stepping over this guy and going on to their train. But I was kind of sensitized to the situation, so I stopped. The minute I stopped, a ring of people stopped around this fellow. We found out he didn't speak English. He was Hispanic. He'd been wandering around with no money for several days, and he had fainted from hunger. Immediately, someone went to get him a hot dog, someone went to get him some orange juice, someone brought someone from the subway authority, and all of a sudden, he was being taken care of. But what it took was that moment of noticing. That was all I really wanted to share, but I know we're going to have a discussion. Matthew, would you join me?
I will. Thank you. I'm very grateful to you for Dan, for taking one particular part of a very rich book. And what I want to do in the questions is to pull you back to the kind of broader thesis of the book, if that's okay. So the book is a lot to do with focus and the importance of focus. And my sense is, if you were to try to sum up quite a big part of the book, it is that there are two good states to be in a sense, in relation to focus. One is to be focused, and the other is, in a sense, to be at peak, to be in a kind of mindful state, as it were, not focusing on anything, letting one's mind wander. These are the two states, to be focused or to let one's mind do what one might. But actually, most of us spend most of our time now in this perpetual state of semi-focus, moving from one thing to another, never being entirely focused and never either relaxing our mind and letting our mind wander. Is that kind of what you're getting at?
Well, I'm trying, in the book, I try to establish the value of each kind of attention. So one is focused attention, which is highly valued. If you want to learn something, if you want to get your work done, you need to be concentrated. Another is an open awareness. You know, if you're out in nature, just enjoying yourself, you want to open the senses. A third is mind wandering. Mind wandering is actually undervalued in school and at work, but mind wandering is essential for creativity, for accessing two novel elements that you combine in a way which has a use. And it's in the thing that you said, Matthew, about where our mind is most often. There's some data on that. It's in the book. I don't know if you recall. There was a group of researchers that gave 2,500 people an iPhone app, which rang them at random points in the day and asked two questions. What are you doing? And what are you thinking about? Right? 50% of the time, people are thinking about something other than what they're doing. That's called mind wandering. Now, it varies. If the single activity, this is perhaps no surprise, that had the highest, my mind is right here, was making love. However, who answers an iPhone app? The most mind-wandering was commuting, sitting at a computer, and being at work. I'm sorry, managers, employers take note, but it is true that most of our minds are elsewhere during work time. But mind wandering has value too. It's just when it's out of place or it's at the wrong time that it's not so good. And then I talk about self-awareness, I talk about empathy and compassion as other varieties of focus that have their uses.
Because the Good Samaritan story, and it's one of my favorite social psychology experiments as well, that seems to imply that what matters is having enough mental space to empathize rather than being primed. Because, you know, one set of psychological insights would suggest to you that this is a classic example of priming. They'd have heard the Good Samaritan story, that would have primed them, and then they would have gone on to show compassion.
Right.
So this priming effect is massively cancelled out by the fact of them being kind of distracted. So that implies that to release our good instincts,
yes.
An empty mind which releases our kind of deeper empathy is more powerful than wandering around in a state of concentrated piety.
Well, there's another way to look at it, which is the difference between espoused compassion or any ethic and enacted. And as you say, if we're well primed, if we're well prepared to enact, then we're more likely to do something in the moment when it presents itself. But if our minds are elsewhere, you know, what am I going to say in this practice sermon? How are they going to evaluate me? Worry like that. Then our focus, our scope of focus collapses into the self-absorption. And so often through the day, we go through whatever situation we're in, focused inwardly, rather than in this open awareness you're talking about.
Now, there's been a lively debate, a continuing lively debate, and in fact it's, I'm certain, going to get more and more lively, between those who are worried about the impact on young people of being surrounded by technology and those who are relaxed about it, or say that certainly there's no evidence to worry about. Now, it seems to me that in that debate you're really on the former side rather than the latter. You think the evidence is growing that the ubiquity of electronic communication devices surrounding young people is having a harmful effect on their capacity to concentrate?
Well, you know, that's an educated guess, really. But what I think is happening is this. All of us, particularly those of us who have lots of technological gadgets, are finding our attention pulled away from where we might choose it to be in very seductive ways. Not in a mean way, but it's just so much more interesting to check your email or see if you've gotten a text, or maybe to wander the web. It's a kind of an allure, really, but what it means is that willed attention becomes more and more scarce. It's a rarer commodity. And attention is a mental muscle. We need to exercise it, and the more we exercise it, the stronger it becomes. And what I'm worried about is that kids are growing up in an environment where they're going to become flabby attentionally. Because, you know, you've got your video games and you've got, you know, I don't know about here in the UK, but in the States, you'll see a 3-year-old staring at a screen because it's easier to manage a 3-year-old staring at a screen. You know, so, you know, parents give kids devices. And to let your attention be passively controlled by that device rather than actively putting it where you want does something very different to the attentional circuit. So that's why I become an advocate, actually, of teaching attentional skills, of exercising this in school. As part of the curriculum. For one thing, it makes kids more ready to learn.
Going back to the point that you made about focus and how people with power, people who are wealthy, simply, as it were, don't attend to poorer people. They don't focus, they screen them out. How does that relate to another phenomenon, which is that it tends to be that people are most obsessed by people immediately above them in the social hierarchy. So if you talk to people who are disadvantaged and you ask them who are the people they most resent, it's very often the people immediately beneath them or immediately above them in the social hierarchy, the undeserving poor, or those who they feel have got minor differentials. they worry about them more than they worry about people who are distant. Is that the same effect that you're describing?
I never thought about that. I think it is related to that. But why do you think the obsession is with those particular people?
Well, I guess it goes to your point about focus, which is that what we do is we look out at people who are like we take most notice of people most like ourselves, I guess is the point that we're making here, rather than the people who are distant to ourselves.
Well, I think it's also the people who may be more consequential in one way in our life space, and people who are close to you may be potential rivals, they may be competitors, but they could be collaborators too.
Just two more questions before I open it up. We obviously think a lot here at the RSA about innovation, an idea. We're an ideas organisation, and there's a kind of notion that one of the reasons people need to work very intensively and, in a way, possibly be surrounded by all this information is in order to innovate. But one of the points you make in the book is that very often inventors say that their great innovations came to them at moments when they weren't focusing, they weren't concentrating.
That's right. Yes, and there's a good reason for that.
Why is that? How does that happen?
It happens because, for example, if you're trying to solve a problem in math, something really intense and abstract, you have to immerse yourself in it. You have to absorb all the relevant information. But most of the brain actually is in what's called the cognitive unconscious. There's a vast secret circuitry that we don't have direct access to, but it keeps everything we know in line, and it also is able to do work to process mentally without our knowing it. And it's when your mind is wandering, when you're walking the dog, when you're getting on the bus, when you're taking the shower, you're not doing anything in particular, that it is able to present its answer to us. So that's why the annals of science and mathematics actually are rife with examples of this, of some brilliant solution coming up, when someone is doing nothing in particular. But it's because their base brain has been working on it very hard.
Now, I don't know how you came up with the idea of emotional intelligence, whether this too occurred to you at a time when you weren't focusing on your studies, but I'm very interested in what happens when you develop an idea with as much power as emotional intelligence, because there's two things that interest me. The first is, are you pleased or disappointed with the degree to which it's actually affected what goes on, particularly in education? Because actually, probably since you brought these ideas to prominence, the intensification of kind of the narrow academic standards approach to schooling has probably increased, certainly has in this country. We've become less emotionally intelligent probably in the way in which we educate children. I think that's happened in the States as well. So the first part of the question is, what's your account of how it is this idea has or has not influenced policymakers? And the other idea is, what's your experience of how people use this idea? When you've had an idea as big as this, which a lot of people who probably haven't read the original book can apply in all sorts of ways, do you kind of get a bit tired of people misusing the idea or applying it in a very kind of woolly way? A
few things. First, I have to disabuse you of the notion that I invented emotional intelligence. Okay. I didn't. It was developed by a friend of mine, Peter Salovey, who's now the president of Yale University, and a graduate student of his at the time, Peter Salovey. But they published it in a very obscure journal. They had an article called Emotional Intelligence. The journal is so obscure it does not exist today. However, I saved that idea. What I did was recognize its value, because at the time I was a science journalist, and what science journalists do is harvest science. And so I thought, this is a terrific idea. At the time, I was thinking of writing a book about what's called affective neuroscience. There'd been an explosion, really a critical mass of new findings about emotion in the brain. I thought, emotional intelligence is a great phrase. It's so counterintuitive. It sounds like an oxymoron. How can you have intelligence and emotion at the same time? So I used that. Since then, it's become startlingly powerful in two sectors particularly. One, as you say, is education. The other is business. It's become kind of standard for assessing leadership abilities. So there are many industries in the business sector. There's a whole legion now of executive coaches, for example, who will help leaders get better at it. And there is a vast movement in education, despite the tightening, maybe because of the tightening of the more academic rigor, because that is not what actually helps children. I was just finishing a piece for The Guardian about a proposal that we use genetic patterns that correlate with IQ to determine what classes children take. And the problem with that research is that they use that exam, what is it? It has 4 letters, GSCE or something?
GCSE.
Yeah. They correlate that and use that as the outcome measure. But the problem is, do you know what the correlation between that exam score and life success is? It's got to be close to 0. And the reason is this, that once you get out of the school setting, how you do in academics matters less and less and less over the course of your career. Unless you stay in academics, then it continues to matter. So if you want to help a child do better in life, it's not that you should have a child ignore studies at all. That's a given. But what you can do is help that child learn to focus. I was visiting a classroom in Spanish Harlem, a very impoverished section of New York. And there every day, these 7-year-olds have a session in what they call breathing buddies. They go to their cubby and they get a little stuffed animal. They find a place to lie down on a carpet. They put the animal on their belly and they watch it rise and fall as they breathe in and out. They count 1, 2, 3 on the in-breath, 1, 2, 3 on the out-breath. And what they're doing is training that attention muscle. And it develops what's called cognitive control. Cognitive control, the ability to keep your mind on one thing and ignore another, not let your mind wander, turns out to be a stronger predictor of financial success in adulthood and health than either IQ or the wealth of the family you grew up in. So I think that...
And is there a genetic component to that capacity?
There's a genetic component to everything, but genetic component is a very misleading term. In genetic science, they don't really talk about the genes you have. They talk about epigenetics. Epigenetics are the environmental forces that turn those genes on and off. And what this does is give a child a capacity that's learnable and improvable that can add a capability to whatever their natural talents are.
Fortunately, I'm debating that genetics and education thesis on the radio on Wednesday night, so you've helped me enormously, Daniel. Thank you very much for that. I shall steal your arguments shamelessly. Okay, so whether we're talking about why rich people ignore the poor, whether we're talking about focus more broadly, or whether we're talking about Daniel's other ideas, including emotional intelligence, the floor is now yours, and we should be entirely focused on the questions that you ask. So who's going to have the emotional intelligence to go first? Here's somebody here.
Hi, thank you for the talk. My name is Alexandra, and I'm currently finishing my PhD thesis in sociology, focusing on happiness. And in happiness and well-being studies, we talk about both mindfulness and flow as essential to human happiness. Yeah. But essentially, these two states are the opposite. Mindfulness and flow
are opposite?
Well, flow is when you're really concentrated on one thing, and mindfulness is when you're aware.
Well, I disagree. I would say that they go hand in hand.
Let her finish the question before you disagree.
My question would be
my
question would be if you could comment on how these two states that I could consider quite different lead to the same emotion or state that we call happiness.
Sure.
Or you can have them both in a sense of multitasking.
Does everyone know? I think this is a brilliant question, by the way. Thank you. I'd like to read your thesis when it's produced. But do everyone, just so people understand the question. So what we're talking about here is flow, which is a key concept of that guy whose name's too long to pronounce. Csikszentmihalyi. Mm-hmm. Which is about being totally in the moment focused on a task. Mm-hmm. Yeah? And you kind of forget everything and you're just absolutely there and you're with it and on it. Mm-hmm. Yeah? And mindfulness is the state where you're supposed to, as it were, not have any thoughts at all. You're supposed to meet your thoughts and take them away and just
exactly
be there on your breath. Okay, so tell us what's,
Yes.
you know,
So-
because I understood the question.
Yeah, it's a very interesting question, and thank you for asking it. So, flow is a state of utter absorption, where your concentration is, 200%, and you're at your best in any domain of expertise. And I know you know this, but this is for anyone who may not be familiar with it. It was discovered by Mahalia Csikszentmihalyi. We call him Mike, actually, for sure.
He'd be so much more famous if he was called Mike Cheeks.
He discovered it by asking people in many different areas of expertise to describe a time you've outdone yourself. He asked ballerinas, basketball players, neurosurgeons, chess champions. And what he found was that everyone described the same phenomenological state, even though they're widely different domains. So a neurosurgeon, for example, said, I had to do this operation. It was so challenging. I didn't really know if I could do it successfully, but I did it extraordinarily well. Even I was surprised. At the end of the surgery, I looked around, and in the corner, there was some rubble. I said, what happened? And the nurse said, well, while you're operating, the ceiling caved in, but you didn't notice. It's that kind of concentration. So flow has other characteristics. It challenges your skills to the utmost, and you're absolutely flexible in how you meet changing demands, and it feels terrific. You talk about happiness. It's a state of happiness. There also is interpersonal flow. Interpersonal flow is what we refer to when we say two people have rapport. When you're with someone and you have chemistry with them and you're really both focused, this full mutual attention is a microflow state. Now, the question of mindfulness is interesting because, as we were saying before, mindfulness has been so widely disseminated in the culture now. It means all kinds of different things to different people. In the original sense, the chap who introduced mindfulness to the culture is John Kabat-Zinn, who is someone I've known since graduate school. And he borrowed methods from the East, which he took out of the religious framework and has disseminated very widely. But mindfulness is actually the faculty that notes what you're thinking, what you're feeling, as you said. You see what's going on in your experience at a bit of a remove, so you're not caught up in your feelings, you're not caught up in your thoughts. This gives you the chance for more choice, for one thing. But it also means if your mind is wandering, you know it and you can bring it back. And the classical use of mindfulness in a meditation context is to notice when your mind is wandering and bring it back, or if you're getting too tired and you need to energize yourself. In other words, to notice that you need something and to correct it. That's actually what mindfulness is for. Here it's being used in a slightly different way. But back to your question, mindfulness is also a state that can be used to induce flow. And if you're equating flow as a marker of happiness, then it actually is part of the package, not different from it. That was a very long answer to a short question.
That's the standard of question we've got to stick to, folks. No, don't be intimidated. Who's next? Yeah.
Yeah, the title of this talk is Do Rich People Just Care Less? Sorry, everyone can read that. But just in terms of that question in particular, what kind of, are you able to expand more on that? I mean, how do we define rich? Are we saying middle class, kind of, I don't know, 50K per year, or are we talking about extreme wealth? So that, people
it's a very interesting question. The research that was done at the University of California simply used indicators of socioeconomic status, and there's a formula in social science for that. They weren't looking at gradations within, rich versus super rich versus really filthy rich versus obscenely rich, nothing like that. It was just relative wealth in that situation. And they extrapolated to social power generally, but I don't think they actually had a measure of social power in that. And also, I wrote an article about this in the other Times, the New York Times. And when you write an article in a paper, you don't get to give the headline. The editor chooses the headline. And the headline they gave it was, The rich just care less. That article went viral. It was the most emailed article from the New York Times for 3 days. And I think it was because of the provocative headline they gave it. But I felt a little bad because I know a lot of people who are fairly wealthy, who are very generous and who really do care. That itself is a stereotype about the rich, because there are all kinds of people who happen to have money. One thing I do know from a friend of mine who tries to raise money for charities is she says that it's easier to raise money from people who are newly rich, so she said, than people who have inherited wealth. And she thinks it's because often they've risen from not having much and understand that reality and want to help people. For example, the CEO of Starbucks is a man whose father was very ill and who had no health insurance. So Starbucks is one of the few coffee houses in America you can work in where you're guaranteed to have health insurance, because he understands how important it is. So I think it's quite variable, and I really am against stereotypes of all kinds, including, quote, rich and poor.
Interesting, though, isn't it, that lots of studies have shown that if you ask rich people what the average income is, they massively overstate what the average income is. So there's also something going on here about how we...
Absolutely.
Again, our reference group is the thing which...
Exactly. And that's what you were alluding to earlier, the reference group. Exactly.
Yeah, absolutely. Who's next? Yeah.
Hello, Stuart Morgan. Listening to you talking about focus, I think I'm hearing you talk very much in terms of the practice of developing attention, the ability to attend to things. And yet, when I came in and read the title of this, Do Rich People Just Care Less?, it seemed to me to be an awful lot more about motivation. And I wondered whether you could comment on whether those things are separate or how they're connected.
Sure. Well, I think they're intimately connected, because no matter what your capacity for attention is, you'll pay most attention to the things you care about most. So motivation drives attention. In fact, emotion generally drives attention. But motivation particularly is crucial for what it is you care enough about to put that much attention on. Good point. Absolutely.
But you're...
Can we change our motivation by practicing how we attend to things?
Well, I think we can change our motivation. I'm not sure we can do it through attention alone. Yes.
But your book argues as a whole that we should just understand attention and focus much more as a concept in our day-to-day lives. So you're motivating us to think harder about attention and focus.
Yes, I'm trying to motivate us to care more about attention. Absolutely true. But I'm not using attention per se to do it. I'm using motivational tactics.
Okay. Oh, my word. Let's have 3 people together, and we'll see how good our focus is, see if we can remember all 3.
Sure.
Okay.
Very quick question. What if you've been diagnosed with ADHD?
Okay, well, remember ADHD? There was someone at the back of the room, I think.
Oh, we're doing 3 at once.
Yeah, we're doing 3 at once. So let's take the gentleman over there with the hair. I mean, lots of people have got hair, but you've got a very particularly impressive follicly.
Thank you. My name's Adam Mendoza. I'm a writer. I spent a lot of my life in the developing world, and I found that even though there isn't necessarily a lot of empathy, there's a lot more empathy than I've found in Europe. And I was wondering, would you put that down to a need for social solidarity because of the conditions of most of those people, or because of tradition, or any other reason?
Right.
Very good. And then we'll take the gentleman here thirdly, and then we'll take these and we'll have another round. Yep.
Hello. Yeah, I could really relate to what you said about focus in the workplace and what impact it has, especially on the sort of like knowledge workers. I would be interested, have you worked together with large organizations, corporations, to make the sort of like leadership more aware of that? And are there any sort of like new ways to actually make it easier on their workers?
Very good. The final 4 or 5 chapters in the book are all about leadership. I read it and I agree with everything that looked like me and disagree with everything that didn't. Okay, so start with ADHD.
Well, let's start here.
Okay.
What's the question in your question, though? Have I
Yeah.
worked with leaders?
Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. So I can understand what you can do from an individual's perspective, but I feel
What can you do organizationally?
exactly
Making a-
because there's a lot of onus
Sure.
on the knowledge worker to do a lot of different things every day. So what do organizations do?
So, right. So one of the organizations that has been most eager in embracing mindfulness is Google. Google is full of knowledge workers. And knowledge work takes concentration, and people that are highly concentrated. By the way, everybody also has an IQ above the 99th percentile. You can't apply for a job there unless you do. So IQ to the side, there's still a bell curve for effectiveness at Google. And one of the things you can do to help people become more effective is to help them manage their attention better, which I think is one reason that Google has embraced, or parts of Google have embraced mindfulness as something to offer people who work there to help manage their attention resources better. Now that gets us to ADHD.
Just on that point,
Yes.
I mean, some companies have done things like reducing the number of, telling people not to open their emails beyond a certain number of times a day,
Well,
and those
that's-
kinds of things. So do you get a sense there are practices emerging now in corporations to
I
address
think
this
that
attention issue?
because attention is under siege in a way it never has been before in human history, and our attentional capacities are suffering as a result, and performance suffers when attention suffers, individuals, groups, and companies are striking back. And one of the things you can do, as you say, is to manage the intrusions. So there are apps, for example, that will turn off your web browser until you really want to go back, that will stop those pop-ups, that will not ping you when you get a text. And if you want to manage your attention, one thing you can do is to turn those things off. There are other things you can do, too. You can get a good night's sleep. Some companies now, are just at Huffington Post, they have nap pods at Huffington Post. They were both occupied when I was over there. But what that does is reboot your mind, reboot your attention for the rest of the day. You can have a low-carb, high-protein breakfast and lunch. There are lots of ways to energize, keep the brain's energy high, which gives you more glucose for attention. So there's all of these things. There's a fellow named Tony Schwartz who blogs for the New York Times, has something called the Energy Project. And I just did a long dialogue with Tony about how you can manage attention. But what he does is go from company to company, telling them how they can help their employees keep their energy up. And attention is a critical part of that. That's a metric. So that was a fourth question you just snuck in.
Sorry, well, let's go back to ADHD.
ADHD, of course, is by definition the inability to keep your focus on one place. And ADD. ADHD is what kids often get diagnosed with. And in adulthood, the H, the hyperactivity, drops off and you have ADD. And it's a problem that doesn't have an easy solution, but has lots of workarounds. And maybe you're aware of the workarounds, but there's a whole industry of people who will coach adults with ADD. They're very good books.
And you prefer coaching to drugs? Because more and more of our kids now are drugged up to the eyeballs.
Oh, for Ritalin, you mean? Yeah, I think that it is silly of us to use a shotgun approach to the brain as any drug is. Every drug, nature economizes on molecules. So when we take a medicine, every medicine has what are known as side effects. What that really means is nature uses this molecule in these 20 to 100 ways, and you may notice them, and we'll call them side effects. So if we give Ritalin to a kid, we may help them focus better, but we're doing a lot of other things to that child's body and brain. And I think it's silly because attention is a skill that can be improved with training. What we've never tried to do is train attention in children in this culture. There now are several pilot projects at universities worldwide on attention training programs for ADD. And we'll be hearing which are the most effective in the next few years. So I think that makes a lot of sense. But one of the obstacles, of course, is how do you pay attention? How do you improve attention in someone who has trouble paying attention? So ask me the same question in 5 years.
And the developing world?
The developing world, that's a fascinating question because I lived in India for 2 years, often in small villages. And as you observe, the social bonds there are extraordinarily strong, and the neighbor helping neighbor ethic isn't even an ethic. It's such a deep norm that nobody even thinks twice about it. And I suspect that's because in any culture or in any native peoples where we just have our ecosystem, and I lived in a village where all that was available in the market was what had been harvested. A truck did come through once a day that left some processed cheese and instant coffee or something like that, but everything else was local crops. In an environment like that, you need to be able to count on people. And it's just a given. And I think that as we become industrialized, as we become civilized and more populous and partialed out each of the functions that everybody used to share, we experience something very different. But as you say, I think it goes with living at that level of need and of needing to count on the people. And as you also allude to, I'm sure there are cultural variations on that.
So that's interesting, isn't it? I'll take 3 more questions, but you're making a point there about the relationship between attention and interdependency. And we were talking earlier about motivation and attention, is that people could attend a great deal more to the interdependencies which exist. And if they did attend to those interdependencies, they might find it easier to attend to people who they instinctively think have got nothing to do with them, but actually may have a lot more to do with them than they think.
Because everybody needs everybody. I describe in the book a wonderful man. I wish I had met him. His name was Mao. He was the last celestial navigator in Polynesia. He was a man who could go from Tahiti to Hawaii without any navigational instruments, just by the winds and the tides and what the fish are doing, and what the clouds are doing. And he could read the signs of nature. And that was a skill that he had learned from navigators for countless generations who had done that and gone back and forth in the South Pacific using just this lore. And that's an example of how native peoples through history have had to read the ecosystem exquisitely and understand the interdependencies. And in a world like that, I think you also naturally have the sense of collaboration. You can't do it alone.
Russell Brand made a very similar point the other night. Okay, well, he did. Yeah, I'll take the lady here, and then gentleman in the back row there.
Hello, Daniel. My name's Christina Rees. I'm a writer, broadcaster, and consultant. And I'd like to go back to empathy and some of what you were saying about empathy and positioning it as something that we need more of. And I'm just thinking about the book on leadership and excellence in leadership that the late Edwin Freeman wrote. I don't know if you know that book. And he actually says that one of the things, a myth about excellence in leaders, is too much empathy. And
is too much empathy?
Too much empathy.
Meaning, what's the myth? That leaders have too much empathy?
That leaders need empathy.
Oh, that leaders need
that's
empathy.
a positive thing in leaders. And he's saying, no, that is a false thing. They shouldn't have that. And if you don't know what he's saying, then...
What did he mean by empathy, do you suppose?
Feeling the feelings of the people that work for you.
Okay. So,
and identifying with them. And he was saying that is actually catastrophic for leaders. But I'm sorry.
Yeah, I would say I disagree with him because I think he doesn't... I have a different understanding of empathy. First of all, there are 3 kinds of empathy. And this is from neuroscience. One is cognitive empathy, understanding how the other person thinks about the world, what their mental models are. This kind of empathy in a leader allows you to understand how to communicate effectively. I'm sure he would say that you do need. Emotional empathy is what he's rallying against. Emotional empathy means you feel instantly in yourself what the other person feels. I would say that he probably assumes that if you feel what the other person you will do what they want rather than what is better for the organization as a whole. I think he's making that assumption. I think that what he doesn't realize is that you can also manage that empathy inside. You can have it, but you don't have to enact it, enact everything it would have you do. And then the third kind of empathy, just FYI, is empathic concern, which is the sense that not only do I understand how you see the world, but how you feel, but if you're in need and I can help you, that I'll do that. And in fact, there's a counter literature on leadership. I recommend George Kohlreiser's work, for example, on secure-based leadership. He argues that the most effective leaders make their direct reports and the people they lead feel understood, empathized with, and supported. And that those, if you make people feel unsupported, that you really don't care about them, they contract and they get very defensive. If you let people feel, I have your back, they can operate at their best, they can take risks, they're not afraid to, and they can actually perform better. So I'd say there's a counter argument in the leadership field.
Back of the room.
Related to that point, it's generally assumed that empathy is a positive thing for the individual in that it enhances their quality of life or whatever. But is that always the case? In deprived communities in well-off countries, people generally don't do well on many measures of health and well-being. I wondered if having more empathy in that situation could actually make your life harder because you're that much more aware of the deprivation and the suffering around you.
Well, it depends. A couple of things occur to me. One is that having that kind of empathy may have been part of the motivation behind the founding of this organization. Remember, this was formed in a coffee house to change society for the better. And people who have empathy for the suffering in society often then can turn that into a kind of energy for change, and for change for the better. That's one. On the other hand, there are people, for example, in the helping professions, who are quite wide open, very empathic to the pain, anger, suffering, and bitterness of the people that they're treating. They take it in themselves, and if they can't metabolize that, if they can't manage it in themselves, they end up suffering an emotional exhaustion and burning out. So I think it could go either way, depending on how you handle it.
Jonathan?
This is a question that comes via Twitter from Michael Cillian. The question is, does something happen to your mind if you live with highly empathetic people? I guess, does it rub off? Does it transfer by osmosis or other processes?
If you're highly empathetic people.
We seem to have shifted our emphasis to empathy. Nothing wrong with that, though, is it?
Well, it was in the title of the talk, wasn't it?
Yeah, fine. Yeah, so living with empathy. Is empathy catching?
I've never thought about that. Emotions are contagious, but the ability to read emotions is either an innate or a learned capacity. And I think it can be improved, but I don't think it rubs off.
But you find that I think you find that in interaction, don't you? Which is you're having a conversation with somebody, and you know that thing where you say, "How are you?" and you say, "I'm fine." You say, "How are you?" and then someone actually answers the question. And it's a bit intrusive, really, because you were just saying, "How are you?" or they should say, "Fine." Then you could go back to talking about yourself, and they actually say, "Well, I'm having my leg taken off on Thursday," or whatever, you know. And you kind of, "Oh, right, okay." So I've got. So I think when people proffer themselves in that situation, it does lead you, doesn't it, to want to be part of that? It's as if they're offering you a high level of...
It may be that they're modeling being empathic and that you then follow suit. Yeah. So what they're doing is shifting a social norm. The social norm, as you say, is let's ask, how are you, and get on with it. We don't really want an answer. But then if someone jumps to another position, which is, I'm actually going to tell you how I am, that calls on something in you. And I think it does draw out some empathy.
So empathy is catching?
Well, I think empathy can be evoked.
Okay, let's take, so we're going to take 3 final questions. We've nearly run out of time. So random, now choosing this person here.
Thanks, Daniel. Well, the question is simple. How, as parents and educators, how could we train our children to enhance their attention span?
Sure.
1, and 2, I'm a student of neuro-linguistic programming, and they talk a lot about states, and switching states, in fact. So how do you relate switching states?
Switching strengths?
Yes, states. That whatever state
states. States.
I want to, I could switch to that desired state.
Mm-hmm.
So how does the focus work in that particular aspect?
Deep waters as we get into NLP. But anyway, there.
Hello, Clara O'Connor, a fellow here at the RSA. You just said emotions are catching. Are some emotions more catching than others?
Stronger emotions are more catching than weaker emotions. Negative emotions are more catching than positive, depending on the relationship of the person. Between lovers, it may be the same, actually. I don't know.
Okay, you have to go back. Well, it's all gone wrong now. Well, answer this one then, and then we'll take one more person after this. So this is, what would you advise in terms of young people and attention?
Well, I describe it. Breathing Buddies is an exercise in intensifying the ability to pay attention. And you would do that in graduated ways as people go up. There's actually a video game being developed now at the University of Wisconsin where kids with an iPad tap the screen on every out-breath and twice on the fifth, and then they get a visual reward, flowers blooming in the desert. And it gets more difficult as you get better and better at it. But what that does is increase your ability to attend. So there's a new generation of video games about to be introduced that will do that. But it's the same, the low-tech way is just to have a kid watch their breath. And I don't know much about NLP, so I can't really answer that question.
Very wise. Okay, I'm going to take there, and then I'll take the gentleman in the front row, and that will be it.
Hi, I'm Faiz Shaheen. I just wondered if lowering the empathy, or narrowing the empathy gap was an argument for also narrowing the income or wealth gap.
Well, I would hope one would follow from the other.
Which order?
Narrow the empathy gap first, and then see what happens.
Very good. And finally.
Yeah, I found the comments on the empathy within the developing world very interesting. I mean, do you feel that in the sort of Western world, with the emphasis on the individual, that can undermine the extent of empathy?
Well, we do know that there are cultures that are more individualist and more collaborative. And generally, the most individualist cultures are the US, Britain, Australia, and the most collaborative are East Asian cultures. And in East Asian cultures, empathy and attuning to the other person is assumed. So, for example, I remember the story of a chap from, I don't know if it was Japan or China. He came to the US, and he was visiting an American family. And they said to him, "Would you like an ice cream cone?" And he was shocked, because in his culture, you would naturally sense the person wanted it and give it to them, rather than having to ask. He said no. He was so embarrassed. He actually wanted the ice cream cone.
It's just occurred to me while I'm sitting here that I will regret this in a moment, but when I was young, one of the cliches used to be that in the days of corporal punishment, that teachers, when they caned you or whatever, would say, "This is going to hurt me more than it's going to hurt you." Do you remember that? It's just how peculiar it is in English culture that the best example of empathy should be associated with beating children. But anyway, I am not going to comment on that.
It's
probably best, it's deep in our own pathology that you understand. Okay, well, look, it's been a fantastic conversation. The questions have ranged widely. I can strongly recommend Daniel's book, Focus, The Hidden Driver of Excellence. If you read it on the tube today, you will find yourself at Morden, even though you meant to go off at Clapham South. But it's a great book, and there are copies available outside, and I'm sure Daniel will sign them for you in a very empathic and focused way.
Perhaps.
So it just rests on me to ask you to thank Daniel Goleman.